Welcome back to our series to talk about global institutional reform, about Pax Europiana, as I like to call it, a strong Europe, a united Europe, a Europe which makes a strong contribution to the world and also for global good governance. And that's basically the focus of that video. There's a famous institution, less famous but very important. It's called OECD. And with my little Austrian German, it's always very difficult and easy to mix up institutions. So I repeat very clearly what I mean. I don't mean the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OECD, as I say, but the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, based in Paris and focused on economic cooperation of the industrialized world. That's how it's more normally described. And it's a very important but not less, a little bit less known organization. And I think it's absolutely time to change that, to make that a more powerful organization and enlarge the OECD to include basically all market economies of the world. So let's talk shortly about the history about OECD, because we are now at a global crisis, at the corona crisis. So it's very important to go back to the years after World War II, when all our institutional framework, which currently governs the world, and not only the Western world, all the world basically, from the IMF, the UN, the World Bank, also later NATO and EU, and they were set up in this critical period between 1945, starting with the UN, setting up the UN San Francisco Conference, to 1960, when the OECD was changed in the current format. So what happened in these critical and important formative years of the New World Order after this terrible conflict? One of the organizations which was set up was the OECD, and it was set up, hooray, for managing the Marshall Fund, which the USA has supported Western European reconstruction, because there was a massive lack of capital. Western Europe was, especially Central Western Europe, was really massively destroyed from the World War II, from the fighting and from the bombing and from the economic devastation and all the terrible things. And so it was set up very wisely by these key leaders of the Western world, President Truman, Mr. Marshall, whose name is famous for his role in Second World War and for this Marshall Fund. He was the Defense Secretary. Dean Acheson, I would like to mention, who was the Foreign Secretary. These were key personalities, very wise leaders, and they said, you know, under the threat of the Soviets, obviously, we cannot let Western Europe fall. Western Germany is very big threat. You know, they all knew what happened after World War I with the communist takeover. They saw the Soviet tanks at the German border. They saw, of course, you know, the start of the Berlin siege, the blockade, which was basically a siege of West Berlin. They saw also the start of the Korea War, and you know, then they decided to set up NATO as the security instrument and alliance, and OECD as the economic platform for cooperating to administer the Marshall Fund, which was significant. We're talking about significant transfer of capital from the US towards Western Europe. And it was really then this Marshall Fund funds, take it or not. This was then the decisions. The Czech Republic, for example, wanted to take it, and then they were not allowed. Yugoslavia somehow was part of accepting it and broke with Stalin over that. That was one of the key reasons. So, you know, that was really very important. This was very, very important, and this OECD organization was the tool to administer it. And it's still very active. It's now mainly famous for global benchmarking exercise, PISA, and, you know, tax competition and tax harmonization. All these debates, it's more famous. Because why? It's important to understand that the focus has a little bit shifted in global governance on the UN, of course. You know, that's the political integration system and global governance system, and in Europe on the EU. And because the political elites wanted to have a stronger UN and a stronger EU, they couldn't really somehow give the same kind of recognition and public value towards all the European institutions, because there is the EU as the most important one in its various predecessor organizations. Then there's the Council of Europe, very much famous for its role in rule of law, and there's OECD. And that's all a little bit confusing even for some very well-informed people. Then you start mixing up Council of Europe, Council of the European Union, OECD, it's a little bit, WTO obviously, and before the GATT. And everybody has a different role, and they had to a little bit to decide which kind of association or organization to really communicate to the population at large. And the decision were clearly for the most important ones, for the UN, for NATO, and for the EU, OECD at that time. And then the OECD took a little bit of a back burner. And so gradually it has done a very successful transformation in 61, and then it was re-established and worked during the Cold War. The world was, anyhow, most of the world was under socialist domination. Let's not forget that the Western world, as we perceived free market democracies, was a minority for most of the Cold War, because most of the African, Asian states and also a lot of the American states were basically in one way or another organized as socialist economies. Yeah? Many people don't want to hear that right now, but it's the fact. It was very small Western world. It was North America basically, and Mexico was basically a socialist economy and a dictatorship. There were just a few countries in Latin America which were not socialist countries, and it was in Africa basically everybody on the socialist camp. And obviously Eastern Bloc and communist world was clear. India was socialist country. There were a few countries like Saudi Arabia which were closely allied, and a few countries in Asia like South Korea, Japan, and some of what later was, I have maybe to make a separate video, this Cold War compromises, where some dubious regimes were supported because they were still on the Western side and not communist, like Chile, like Indonesia. But most of the world was basically socialist dominated. So for OECD, there was no way to enlarge very much, and they continued to be the rich world's body, the rich world's meeting place. Basically, the economic ministries took it under their consideration and care, and so it continued, and it was then only after the end of the Cold War, the victory in 1990, 91, it was then gradually enlarging, taking in also the new democracies from Eastern Europe, and some of the other democracies of the world have also gradually joined, especially Chile, there's Colombia, there's some others who are considering. And so the organization is there. It doesn't have a very strong role in the world visible, but it's now tasked to organize these G7 summits and these world economic events, and also after the economic crisis of 2008, it got a bigger role by organizing the G20. G20, very famous term, the biggest 20 economies, but basically who is behind it, actually who prepares the meeting, who organizing, who gives the content, is the OECD. So it got a new role, and it has somehow then also started to think about enlargement again and to be more active. Yeah? And it has made some progress, but then came the point in 2014, obviously, where things started to change again in Europe with the aggression of Russia towards Ukraine, and the idea to include Russia into, there was this period of the G8, and that was of course then logically ended, and again the G7, and then the idea to have Russia in the OECD was also ended and frozen. And so basically the whole enlargement process of the OECD has come to a stop. There were the Baltic countries still to join, but it is really currently in a standstill. And that is wrong. That is totally wrong. And what we need is a strong OECD, because we don't need a new institution in this crisis. We don't need to invent the wheel again. We just have this very well working institution in Paris called OECD. And we have to do two things. First of all, we have to transform the organization clearer into the union of market democracies. So all countries who are market economies and democracies are allowed to join and should join. So the organization should not have a big ambition to be a supranational organization, a union. That's not the way. That's for the EU and for regional organizations. I will talk later for the African Union, for ASEAN, for others like the OAS. That's a separate thing and a separate video. But now this organization, to be clear, all market economies, meaning WTO members, and democracies, that means certain basic standards of human rights, of political participation, of media freedom, to join the OECD. And this is really how we will organize the next period of globalization, the next 30 years, very much driven by the standards of the OECD, not the club of the rich Western countries, of the Northern Americans and the Europeans, but including African states, including American states, including Asian states, on the condition that they are democracies and market economies. So this is the way ahead for the OECD. Change a little bit the mission, open it up, and include India, include Brazil, include Argentina, include Nigeria, include South Africa, include Egypt. Okay, Egypt maybe has a little bit of application and reform process, but okay, let's promise them OECD is possible if you reform. That's the way to do it. Let's make a 5-year channel and accession process for the countries which are currently not full democracies. Then we can ensure democratization of these countries, assisted by the OECD, and having a target to join once this democratization process is completed. Ultimately, most of the American and African and Asian states should join. Only the ones who are really aggressive, like Russia, or who are clearly not a democracy like China, they can not join. That's very simple. If they perform, they can join. If they reform into democracies, they can join. If they behave like that, breaking all the UN rules, invading other countries like Russia does, or being openly a communist country, please, that's not the Union of Democracies. That's not the OECD. That marketing democracies is something different. And so this is very much the way forward. So what I say. And it's very specific proposals which I will make now. First of all, to include all these countries I've mentioned already, and then to make all members of OPEC especially an offer. OPEC, this is this dangerous and